Hello and welcome to Mediation Works. I'm Wendy Lakusta and I'm here with my co-host Sharon Sutherland.
Hi.
And today we have a special guest, Brink, and we're going to be talking about collaborative law. And that's the area of practice that Catherine specializes in. And I thought a good place to start off, Catherine, if you're okay with it, would be to talk generally about the process, what it can look like and what people can expect in the process.
Great, and thanks for having me. So generally what I tell clients who come to see me is, there's a number of different options that they can take when wanting to resolve a family law dispute. And so sometimes people can sit down together at a kitchen table and are able to work things out between themselves. Sometimes that doesn't work. And an option like mediation, where they sit down with someone neutral to have that help them facilitate that conversation, can really work. There's also times where there's so much conflict that sitting down in a room with one neutral mediator maybe isn't quite enough support for the parties to really help them get to resolution. So another option that kind of works along that continuum is collaborative process, and that's where both parties have their own lawyers, and the lawyers, what's important to just sort of distinguish collaborative process apart from, say, negotiation just with lawyers, is that the lawyers are trained in the collaborative process, and part of that is actually a full mediation training, and everyone, the lawyers and the parties, sign a participation agreement which says we are not going to go to court. So we are focused on sitting down and working together to find the best resolution for our family. And the lawyers say, if this doesn't work, for some reason this doesn't work, we're not going to go off to court, and you're never going to see us on the other side in court. And that helps create a lot of safety in the room, so that people know, okay, we're really here to work towards settlement. We're really, it's not just sort of, okay, if this doesn't work, we're headed off to court. It's really focused on what's important to the parties and what's important to their kids, and how do we make something work from that. And it creates a lot of, it creates a space where we know there's confidentiality, so the lawyers can't go out and use that information that, maybe you put a little bit of, put some things on the table that you wouldn't otherwise put on the table, and it creates that sort of space. So the other part of collaborative, which is really quite neat, is we work with a number of different professionals where needed. So we've got what we call divorce coaches, and they're counselors who are trained in the collaborative process, and they often work on the parenting, or if there's a lot of emotion going on, they help really work through that and help the parties communicate. Because for people who have kids, this may be the end of their relationship as spouses, but it's not the end of their relationship as parents. And so how do you really get this family so that they're making the transition in the best way possible? And this can happen, there can be a lot of conflict. A lot of people tell me, well, it doesn't feel very collaborative between my ex and I right now.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually, that doesn't mean that the collaborative process won't work. It's just that here the collaborative process has more support in terms of the teams that are available.
Yeah, actually, Catherine, I was going to just ask you a little bit about that, because I know Wendy and I both get a lot of calls as mediators from people who are saying, where do I go? And it's usually about family mediation. And it usually comes up in those cases where people are saying, it's really heated between us. And I've heard you talk before, so I've often said, have you thought about collaborative? And the reaction is often, yeah, right. The other person is such a jerk, and there's no way that they could collaborate, and that word just doesn't resonate.
Yes.
But what I'm hearing you saying actually is, on the continuum, you probably actually get more support when you're in a collaborative process than you might in other types of processes. And I was going to ask you to talk about some of the stuff about how do you kind of customize the process to work with parties who might have really high conflict, or who might have other kinds of challenges in their relationship.
Yeah, well, one of the joys I have in working in the collaborative process is working with divorce coaches, child specialists, and also financial specialists. So there are these three sort of different groups that can be used on an as-needed basis. Sometimes people get a little worried and think, oh my gosh, how much does this cost if you're having all these professionals? But it's really used as needed. And so where there's a lot of emotion, for example, sometimes people are at different stages of the separation, and there's more support needed.
Yeah.
And coaches can really come in and help that process. And it can either be one coach, they're called divorce coaches, but they're counselors or psychologists who have the training in collaborative process, so they're really trained in that transition of going through separation.
Helping people move, as you said earlier, from their relationship into co-parenting.
Co-parenting.
Yeah.
Or sometimes for people who don't have kids, also just getting that sort of the emotions can be so front and center that making any decisions that is going to affect their finances and all sorts of things in the future it's going to be a great help. So that's one, bringing them in as needed, and you're not overlapping with the lawyers. You're instead of using lawyers to do work that really we're not trained to do, we don't have the expertise of child development. You're using the right professional to help. So
to get people grounded.
And often that really, when they come back to the meetings with the lawyers, it goes a lot more smoothly.
So it sounds like you almost have a toolbox of professionals that you can bring in to help out.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned kind of the costs and trying to think about, customizing around that, because I know that is one of those weird questions that you get all the time.
Yes.
And there's lots of studies out there these days about the enormous cost of litigation. Obviously there's all the emotional costs, but just the pure financial cost of going through a process like that, there's not as much information about what that looks like collaboratively. And you do have that, well, there's so many professionals, what does that look like?
Yeah.
I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that. I know that's a big concern for people.
It is, and it's a different, it's more costly. Obviously with the collaborative process, you've got two lawyers and you're paying two. So what happens, I should probably back up and say, what happens in the collaborative process is usually you have an initial meeting with the lawyer, your own lawyer, and then you come and meet in a room together with the two lawyers. And so it's similar to mediation in that sense that you're coming together and you're doing a lot of the work sitting in the room together. So there's not letters going back and forth. There's not sort of this, discussion that the clients are not involved in. Really, the discussion, the clients still have to do the work, but the lawyers are there supporting and helping to advocate in a team approach. So it's a very different feeling in a room.
So rather than people going off and getting their own lawyers and then have the lawyers talking to each other, the parties themselves are encouraged to speak for themselves and be an active part of the process.
What are their needs? What are their hopes? What are they worried about in this process? And bringing all that to the table, so it's not just a discussion over, what are legal rights, but what's going to work for this family.
I like that. I like how that aspect of getting away from the legal rights and more into what are the specific needs of this family.
Because there's always a range.
What are their interests? What are their
and how at the end of the process, what's going to work? What resolution is going to be more enduring than something that a judge who knows this much about the parties can order? They have very limited time to get to know what the parties need, and they work in a certain framework. So
absolutely, and as mediators, we know well that if people have a voice and if people are part of have input in the process, you get greater buy-in. There's no question, and more durable agreements.
More durable, and you don't have people coming back years down the line saying, if you do, you're not back in court fighting about what does parenting look like, what is the schedule, what does child support look like. You have these conversations with parenting. You go back to the divorce coaches. You don't ever even come back to the lawyers unless for some reason that's needed. But really, you work on the kids are 5 years older. What does that look like now? How do we work through this?
Awesome.
And it's a lot. So the cost later on, I think, what you get from a process that's interest based like mediation is that the agreements are much more adaptable for the family themselves and work for them.
Yeah, I think that's something that we see in mediation actually too, is that when you've really had a good mediation, it's not just that the parties aren't going back to lawyers again. They may not be coming back to mediators. They may not need help at all because they've figured out they can trust each other because something has been working, and a change in an agreement might be something they can do easily between themselves because now they trust each other to follow the agreement.
Exactly.
And I would imagine in collaborative law that trust building, relationship building, and just modeling that you can actually work through some of your problems.
Absolutely.
And it carries on from there, hopefully.
And the coaches, I find, are really key for helping with that communication piece. They really, it's amazing and sometimes when you have also child specialists come in, and they're someone who would meet with the kids to say, you know, what's going on with the kids. Often kids in going through separation, parents are really worried, what's really going on with, you know, my children? Like, what are they thinking? How do I help them through this process?
Sure.
And there's a lot of questions and unknowns around that.
Right.
And sometimes they'll say to one parent one thing and another thing to the other parent, and that creates a little bit of conflict. But the children, they just want to they want their parents to be happy.
Of course.
So you get this child specialist who comes and meets with the kids and comes into the process and says, hey, this is where they're at. You know, this is what you could help them with. This is, you know, what they're really feeling from a sort of neutral point of view. So, and I've seen that breakthrough impasse in amazing ways where, you know, one parent is saying, well, no, they've been telling me this one thing. And the other parent saying, no, I've heard something totally different.
Yeah.
So it's pretty neat that way.
And in terms of customizing the process, do you ever use mediation as a part of the collaborative law process? And if so, do you bring in an outside mediator to be a part of it?
So there's different ways in which it can come into play, and one of them is, you know, if the parties are hitting real impasse, or if the lawyers are really struggling to get past a certain point, it can be helpful to bring in someone, and that may be, you know, bringing in the divorce coach who's been working with them. It may be, you know, bringing in an outside mediator who's going to just help go through this apparent impasse. So that's definitely one piece of it. And I think the reverse is also with mediation. You know, for people who are mediating, sending out to collaborative lawyers for independent legal advice. You know, here are people who are trained in mediation, who work within the interest-based negotiation model, and they're going to support that you know, process of parties coming to their own resolution. So.
And absolutely, I know when I'm not doing family mediation, I have my roster of mediation friendly lawyers to refer to for sure. And you're on that list.
Okay, Catherine, I have one more question. I realize we're running out of time here, but I do want to ask you one more thing, because you've talked before about the collaborative process and just the strength of the process and possibilities for using it other places, because we only really hear about it with the idea of separation.
Yes.
But can you talk a little bit about the possibilities for collaborative process in other areas? What do you see?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's definitely started in separation. That's where the collaborative movement started, and it's actually expanded. I know in BC, we haven't seen it expand to estates disputes quite yet, but I think it's really on the verge. It's already done that in California in both estate planning or estate. Instead of estate litigation or mediation, there's this collaborative process where you have representation from all sides, and civil litigation. You know, wherever there's any kind of business relationship, I see that definitely moving to be a sort of more safe process, so that the relationship can continue after that, and it's not just destroying.
So in any situation where relationships are really important, ongoing, and are you seeing mainly they're at the dispute level as opposed to the preventative level?
I think both levels are. I mean, I know in my practice, also doing, where people are planning a relationship together and they want to, move forward, but they don't want to sort of start it off on the wrong foot, and they really want to have clarity around what does this look like financially for us. And so they can come in and have that conversation in a supportive, safe way.
So that would be like before marriage or before moving in together, or those kinds of relationships?
Absolutely.
And I know when you were saying planning, you were saying it around estate planning too.
Yes.
So I'm imagining circumstances where you've got an aging parent and siblings get together and think this is a really hard conversation to have.
Yes.
And maybe there's problems with parental health. Sometimes it's mental health issues. We have increasing dementia and all kinds of issues that nobody wants to talk about. I could imagine divorce coaches and collaborative lawyers being a wonderful support in a process like that.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. No, I think that there's so much flexibility when you think of both mediation and collaborative practice to suit, have a client-centered approach, what's going to work. And anywhere there's conflict and where people want to continue to keep that relationship together or building and not sort of being tearing apart families. It can be helpful. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Catherine, for joining us today. And that was really helpful, and hopefully will encourage people to get much more involved in collaborative processes.
Yeah, and Catherine, we're going to make a point of making sure that we include any kind of resources you might have linked to this video.
Perfect.
So hopefully people who are interested will be able to follow up.
Excellent.
Thank you
Great.
so much.
Thank you.